Replaying games is dangerous, and that's because it can be one of the best or worst decisions you can ever make. Where games we once hated as kids can turn into adventures of a lifetime when experienced as adults, or titles we looked at with such glee and nostalgia before transform into utter trash. So today, I'm going to break down some of the most radical changes of heart I've had in my now over 2 decades playing video games. From titles I played as a kid and loved, only to grow out of them, to journeys that for years on this channel I've thrown hate towards, only to today come back and humbly admit that I was wrong all along. Here are the games I've changed my mind on the most. I don't know if you guys are the same way, but for me, I'm constantly in search of games that are more than just fun, more than just a time sink, but instead experiences that last with us forever. And that's why going into playing Outer Wilds originally, I was beyond excited. I had heard the game was something really special, and at its core was a journey unlike any other out there, where every day you wake up to find yourself in a universe with only 22 minutes left until the sun goes supernova and everything dies, only for you to awake once again with little time to save the galaxy. It's an amazing premise, but one that when I finished my first playthrough and felt almost nothing at all, I was devastated. This was a game that was practically made for me. Sci-fi, eccentric, contemplative, and meaningful. It hit all the marks I was looking for, and yet I had so many problems with it. I didn't like how the puzzles you solved in the game were so rigid and lacked the ingenuity and agency of something like, say, Prey, my second favorite game of all time, rest in peace Arcane. And because I had rushed my way through the main story in order to figure out what happened, I missed so much. It was cool flying between different planets and discovering secrets, but the way I played the first time was trying to piece these hints together as quickly as possible and getting frustrated anytime I had to try something new and the game's pacing came to a halt. So honestly, I came away thinking Outer Wilds was beyond overrated, and to a certain extent, maybe it still is. After all, the fan base for this title knows no bounds to its love. But if I'm being honest, in retrospect, and after coming back to this game after some time, along with a new mindset, it really is, in a way, quite magical. Sailing through the stars, especially when you don't know what's out there yet, provides a feeling of exploration unmatched by any other game. And when the music kicks in just right as you make your way through a tornado of water on a creepy planet, or a black hole swallowing a figment of space piece by piece, it becomes perfectly clear why this title is so beloved. When I was replaying this game for the second time and taking things slower, I at one point stumbled upon a strange NPC hidden away in the corner of one of the planets, playing an instrument and looking into the night sky, simply humming a tune that for eternity carried on, cycle from cycle. And it's moments like these that make you realize what Outer Wilds is all about. This isn't a game you should try to finish as fast as possible like I did at first. It's one where you're encouraged to take your time, explore, and at your own pace unravel the mysteries of the universe itself. And boy, what an amazing ending this game has as well. Originally, when I first played, I got an ending where everyone died and I uncovered some secrets as to what was really going on. But if you take your time and go even deeper, you can find endings that I would consider some of the most beautiful in gaming history, and make you question not only the game and its meaning, but also the meaning of life and beauty altogether. And as boring as Outer Wilds can be at times, if I'm being honest, as frustrating as it was my first time around, over a year later, and after giving it another shot, I finally get it. I get why it's such a darling in the industry, considered by many the greatest indie game ever made, and by some, the greatest game full stop. Because even though it certainly isn't my personal favorite, and like I mentioned, I still do have a handful of gripes with the experience, and things I think a potential sequel could do to make it almost perfect, all of which I talked about in my Outer Wilds review, by the way. In retrospect, what an amazing game Outer Wilds 1 really is. I'll admit it. I was wrong. Outer Wilds isn't nearly as overrated as I originally thought, and truly is home to some of the most unique and unforgettable journeys in a game I've ever gone on. Without a doubt, a title I've completely changed my mind on, and we have a lot more where that came from. Out of all of the games I've ever played in my life, Baldur's Gate 3 is without a doubt one of the greatest. It essentially combined my two favorite genres, that being role-playing games and immersive sims, and molded them into one coherent package that is as deep as it is wide, with hundreds of hours of super high quality content that all results in what I would consider the best RPG ever made. However, for as great as the title is, as I've played it more and more, and have had now a few months to think back on all of my thoughts and gather myself, I do think that in some ways, there are things that could be even better, that myself and many others have looked past, especially on initial release. First of all, one thing I really did press on in my original review of the game before it launched was that the characters were way too sexual. I understand wanting to have romantic options in games and making a connection with your favorite character, but in my opinion, literally no game has ever pulled this off right, except for save one, Cyberpunk 2077, and Baldur's Gate 3 is no exception. When every single one of my party members wants to fornicate with me with almost no effort, it almost feels cheap, and in a way, it takes away some of the sophistication from these characters. Another example is how so many of the companions are pansexual too. No matter what gender or type of character I pick, whether that be a giant lizard man or a tiny gnome girl, everyone is down to engage in bedtime activities at all times. It makes these characters feel less like people and more like computer-generated NPCs, and also makes the relationships feel so unrealistic, where rather than having preferences like in real life where people would deny me if they aren't into me, everyone just wants it. Real love is the work you have to put in and the struggles you went through together to find peace, not just lust and trying to gamify taking each other to bed. And while it's okay to have some characters like that, when your entire ensemble is so horny, it just feels weird. But even more than that, after all these months, another thing that's really bothered me now about the newest entry in the Baldur's Gate series is the world building and story. You see, I've always been a sucker for great worlds and stories in games, and it's why I find those things so much more fascinating than, say, characters usually, because the ideas that make me think and light my imagination on fire with possibilities are so much more intriguing to me than just decently written fake people. And in the case of Baldur's Gate 3, thinking back on the game now and after going back to it a couple times months later, the story and world really weren't as interesting as I remembered. The entire main plot of getting a worm out of your head is cool at first, but because of the scope of the world, the pacing often comes to a halt where I would often forget what my main objective even was, or that there was a tadpole crawling around in my brain. And when you combine that with characters that for the most part don't stand out as much as greats from other games, you are left with an adventure that, while fun, lacks the same sense of purpose that I've felt in other games. But I also want to stop here to remind everyone watching this, I still would say Baldur's Gate 3 is the greatest RPG ever made. The amount of choice and consequence, a world that radically realizes what the player does, and hundreds of ways to tackle any situation that makes actually playing the game so engaging, it's hard to argue otherwise. It's just that in retrospect, I think the story and characters could have been handled so much better. The way in which the plot unfolds, the stakes at play, and how characters connect with the world just never reaches the highs of many other great RPGs. For example, after beating the game, I wouldn't say I was especially interested in watching videos on lore of the series, like I was after beating, say, Mass Effect, Cyberpunk, or Dragon Age. And when you have just out-of-pocket scenes like this with the Emperor, where he tries to be romantic with you, it just feels so off in Baldur's Gate 3. I get that the game is based on D&D, and part of the tabletop experience is wacky things like this, but when one of your main villains breaks character this hard and tries to become a love interest, even if for nefarious means, it just feels cheap and honestly kind of weird. For me, it took all of the stakes out of the experience, forcing me to play for the unbelievably great gameplay and RPG systems rather than a story I can really connect with. When I play something like, say, Dragon Age or Mass Effect, I'm utterly captivated at all times trying to learn about the world, what went on in the past, and just getting immersed with everything around me. But with Baldur's Gate 3, I'm just kind of having fun and not taking it that seriously, because the game doesn't take itself that seriously. So in other words, while Baldur's Gate 3 is utterly amazing, and I truly mean that, one of the greatest games ever made full stop, over time, I definitely have soured a little bit on it as well, and don't regard it as nearly perfect like I did before. And that doesn't mean I don't think Larian are some of the best in the business, and for a huge part of the community, the writing in Baldur's Gate 3 and the companions and story is exactly what they wanted. But for me, I would love to see something a little more grounded and serious, with companions and a world that feels better and more fleshed out. Give me the systems of a Larian game with the writing and world building of an old school BioWare title. Because with that, you're essentially talking about the perfect game. And if anyone can do that, it's Larian, or maybe CD Projekt Red. Have you guys ever come back to a game you hated as a kid and wondered what you were thinking? Because for me, it happens all the time, and that's because our opinions change, our worldviews shift, and what we find enjoyable radically transforms with age. But in terms of games like this, maybe none have seen such a reversal of fate from my own condemnation quite as much as Dragon Age Origins, and really the entire Dragon Age IP. You see, when I was growing up as a kid, without a doubt my single favorite franchise was Mass Effect. And when I finally beat the game the first time around and found myself left with a void in my heart begging for more, I thought what better place to go than an upcoming game called Dragon Age Origins from BioWare, the same team behind Mass Effect. However, unlike Mass Effect 1, when I first played Dragon Age Origins, I wasn't a fan at all. The art design and world seemed gray, dark, and boring. The gameplay was immediately unwieldy and cumbersome. The UI and user experience was absolutely a struggle to get used to. The enemy design and threat from Loghain came off as uninspired and generic. And on top of all of that, I didn't care about any of the characters around me or understand what this world was really about. I gave it a couple of hours to sink my teeth into, but as time carried on, my boredom and frustration only grew. Dragon Age just didn't give me that same magical feeling that Mass Effect had years ago. So for over a decade since that point in time, I have consistently bashed Dragon Age as a series. And if I'm going to be completely honest with you guys, over a year ago when I finally made a Dragon Age Iceberg after people begged for it for months, I remember thinking to myself how overrated the lore was the entire time I was making it. At least compared to a lot of other games I had already done videos on, like Elder Scrolls, Witcher, Mass Effect, and Cyberpunk. However, about a month ago as of writing this, due to a lack of new game releases that interested me, and a dying urge to play something that made me feel like Mass Effect 1 did as a kid, I decided to finally give Dragon Age one final shot, and all I can say is, I've never been so wrong, because without a doubt, this is one of the greatest role-playing games and series ever made. You almost forget just how good old school BioWare games were when you haven't played one for a while, but almost immediately this time when I picked up Origins, I was swept up in the world. You get to pick from 6 different starting states or origins right at the beginning of the game, and each of these provides hours of custom content that you only get to see if you play as that origin character. For example, I picked a human mage who found himself at the Circle of Magi, and it was here that I learned about the harrowing, a grueling trial all apprentices must undergo in order to become a full mage, and if they fail, they transform into a monstrosity that must be slain or trapped forever in the nightmare realm known as the Fade, which is separated from the mortal realm by a barrier called the Veil, which mages pierce through to tap into magic, which opens them up to demonic possession. And it's ideas like this that are instantly front and center that make the series so special. Just like with Mass Effect, Dragon Age is a world full of interesting lore and backstories, like the Tranquil I found at the Circle of Magi in my origin story, who are mages that lose their ability to see the Fade, and with it, their connection and emotions to the real world, making them act like mindless husks. And it's a world full of dark and gritty themes too, of torture and abuse, war and betrayal, but also, along the way you get to assume a group of lovable and memorable characters like Alistair, Leliana, and Morrigan. Whenever I had tried Origins before my most recent playthrough, I always struggled to get into the gameplay and combat, and that also resulted in me skipping through the dialogue and not getting immersed in the world at all. But playing it again now that I'm older, I love how tactical it is, how many spells there are, and all the different combos and things you can do in combat that really add a lot of depth to the experience. Because if you're really in the mood for something more slow and introspective like Origins, it just works so well. You can sit and talk with NPCs with tons of dialogue choices to choose from, and every book or pamphlet you find on the ground adds an extensive entry into your codex to dig into the lore even more. And really, it just goes to show how much better a game feels when the world building is top notch. Even though the graphics now are very dated in Origins, and especially the fade sections are annoying to glare at, it's easy to look past that when the stories and history of this world you are in are told in such fascinating ways that you start to read pages of text about fake events in a place you didn't care about just an hour before. Because Dragon Age Origins world building is truly unmatched. The ideas of what Elysium even is, what the Magisters did at the Black City, the conspiracies behind the Tranquil, the inner workings of the Fade, the mysteries of the long-forgotten and powerful empires of the old elves and dwarves, and what will happen when there are no more old gods for blights. And these are all topics that are touched on and expanded in such fascinating ways in Dragon Age 2 and Inquisition, and now after playing through the entire series recently, I'm so excited for Veilguard and where it could potentially go, especially when it comes to the world building and lore of this fascinating series. And honestly, I have no idea how I didn't find this stuff interesting before, because in retrospect, after playing Dragon Age Origins first and then going on to the other games, rather than mainly only playing a little bit of Inquisition like I did before, you get so much more context into why all of these topics are so cool, and even going back and watching my very own Iceberg lore video on the series which I made, it's so much more interesting to me now that I've played Origins in full. When a game has a universe and world building as good as this, it can quite literally make everything that comes after it even better. For example, while I found Dragon Age 2 boring and Inquisition tedious at times after playing Origins, man did some of the lore and moments hit so much harder even in those games because of how much Origins had immersed me in this world. And really, there's nothing else to say besides I got it wrong. If you've ever heard me mention on this channel how I don't like the Dragon Age series that much, you can just ignore that from now on. Because Origins, and really the whole Dragon Age series, is without a doubt some of the best role-playing games ever made, with fun and memorable casts of characters, a captivating story in each, deep gameplay builds and tactics, especially in Origins, and a world you can get utterly lost in. I wish more than anything I could go back in time and play the Mass Effect trilogy for the first time all over again. There really isn't any other franchise out there quite like it, and with each new installment, things were reinvented while keeping the core of what makes the series great. And that's why during the original announcement of the second game when I was a kid, I was beyond excited. I watched every cinematic hype trailer, read every article, and consumed any little bit of media I could up until the release. And when I finally got my hands on Mass Effect 2, I was in awe. The huge cast of cool characters, the new pseudo-villain with the elusive man, and the now famous ending where you can potentially lose your entire crew that you've spent hours with up to this point. I hadn't played any games where the stakes were so high in my life, and considering it was from a series where I absolutely adored the first game, I was hooked. But strangely, over time, my opinion on Mass Effect 2 has taken a complete turn for the worst. You see, even going back today and playing Mass Effect 1 or 3, I feel a sense of magic that is hard to describe. It's like the games were made specifically for me. And while Mass Effect 2 has some of that, I think in retrospect, going back and playing years later many times, it's not only the worst Mass Effect in the original trilogy, but also is missing so much of what I love about the series. First of all, as cool as the characters were on my first playthrough, going back and spending time with them now feels a lot more boring. After playing games like Cyberpunk 2077, and even later BioWare titles like Dragon Age Inquisition, in comparison, the companions in Mass Effect 2 feel so hollow and one-dimensional. Sure, there are some pretty decent arcs like Liara becoming the Shadow Broker, Thane coming to the light, or Jack learning to love again, but the writing on offer here, while fine, doesn't hold a candle to more modern and mature takes on relationships in games I play now. But that's just one personal opinion. I still definitely get why people adore these characters so much, and there are some standouts here for me too, like Mordin, Tali, or Legion, who are really awesome. But even with these characters, their greatest moments are in the first and third game, not the second. My true biggest gripe with the second installment in the trilogy though, is it lost a lot of my favorite aspects, especially from the first game, like world building. You see, in the first Mass Effect, at one point at the start of the game, you land on the Citadel for the first time and are essentially stuck there for hours while you talk to aliens and get to know the universe. And while for many people this might sound and was boring, it's exactly what made this series so special for me in the first place. The original game was all about world building, exploring the galaxy, and learning about brand new worlds and species we'd never seen before. In contrast, the second game feels like a bunch of character stories set in a generic universe that culminate in a climactic ending. And to top it off, none of these characters have any real agency. Shepard can be as mean or nice to them as possible, and they still follow him into battle, as opposed to something like, say, Dragon Age Origins, where companions will turn against you and try to kill you if you wrong them. But the even bigger thing is, I don't play Mass Effect for the characters. I know a lot of people do, but for me, far and away what makes this series great is the world building and writing. Learning about the Reapers, Sovereign, the Rachni, the Thorian, or the Protheans is just so much more interesting than learning about why some random goth girl with tattoos is angry. Because honestly, I've played a lot of games with characters that have mommy and daddy issues that they have to work out with the help of the player character, and many do it better than Mass Effect, sorry to say. I've played plenty of games with bromances and friendships that really stand out, and Mass Effect, as great as it is, isn't something truly special with people even like Garrus and Rex. But what was and is truly special about Mass Effect is the world and stories it tells. I mean, truly, discovering things like the Rachni for the first time in a top secret research facility on Noveria is so much more interesting than having a love interest with an NPC that will pretty much like you no matter what you do. And on top of that, the second Mass Effect barely moves the plot forward. If you really take a step back and think about what actually changed with the story of Mass Effect 2, it's essentially just a filler episode of a TV show with a cool ending, where sure, you get to meet a lot of characters that you build connections with for Mass Effect 3, but the actual narrative and what happens here is so disjointed and pointless. You could literally just play Mass Effect 1 and 3 and the main plot would essentially stay exactly the same. The only issue is you would have less background on some of the characters and you wouldn't know who the elusive man is at first. Whereas in the first game you get great build-ups and reveals like meeting Sovereign and discovering he's a Reaper for the first time. In Mass Effect 2, Cerberus is just everywhere and has all the resources they need with no justification or build-up outside of one small mission in Mass Effect 1. And even looking at something I enjoy about the second game, like the ending, I actually even like the ending of, say, the first game even more. It was more spectacular, more movie-like, the stakes felt higher, and the main bad guy we were going up against felt so much more imposing, along with the environment, in my opinion, being so much more fascinating and awe-inspiring. Or what about even the combat, another stumbling block for the second installment? Whereas in the first game the combat was extremely janky, it allowed for hilarious builds like being a biotic who could literally throw bosses off the map with force pushes that would send them 100 feet in the sky. In contrast, the third game felt super refined and fun, with tactical third-person combat that was balanced and actually fun to play, even for modern shooter standards. But the second game in comparison was a weird middle ground between the two that was janky and refined at the same time, with a lack of true identity that BioWare finally found in Mass Effect 3 and Andromeda. Or essentially, in retrospect, I really and truly believe that Mass Effect 2 is far and away the worst game of the original trilogy, and I don't even think it's close. And for any of you that still disagree with me and do say the second game is the best, after all, it's by far the most loved if you read about it online, I have a test for you. Play Cyberpunk 2077 and do all the character missions there, and then go back and play the entire Mass Effect trilogy, and tell me that you're still in love with the second game and that the characters are what make this series great. Because in my opinion, they were always cool and fun, but never absolutely amazing. And because the second game focused so much on them rather than the world building, lore, story, and universe, what actually made Mass Effect special, the second game suffered greatly. So much so that nowadays when I replay the trilogy, I struggle getting through it and want to just skip it. Because the true beauty of Mass Effect isn't the characters. They are an important aspect and do make the games better. But the core of this series was always the huge set pieces and unbelievable reveals that made you sit back in awe and think about a universe that doesn't exist, but one you can get utterly lost in. For someone that has made multiple Fallout videos, with many of them being my most popular ever, you would think that I've always been a huge fan of the series, but almost ironically, that couldn't be any further from the truth. When I was growing up, my first Bethesda game ever was Oblivion, and from the moment I set my eyes on Cyrodiil, I was utterly hooked to the Elder Scrolls. I loved the exploration, the music, and the almost whimsical nature you would feel traveling through the wilderness and stumbling upon a new monster hidden in the tree line. It instantly solidified an early love for Bethesda for me, and that love carried over to Skyrim and even bouts with Morrowind. In fact, this love is what eventually convinced me to give other Bethesda IPs a shot as well, primarily Fallout. And yet, when I finally got around to trying Fallout for the first time, I hated it. I remember booting up Fallout 3 specifically as a kid and finding the introduction cumbersome and boring. I didn't care about the characters or world, and I was skipping every dialogue prompt and furiously running around trying to get out of the vault to see what was outside. And when I finally did, I wasn't met with a beautiful vista and serene, cozy feeling like in the Elder Scrolls, but rather I was greeted by a completely barren, desolate, and gray wasteland. As I traversed my way around, everywhere I looked was nothing but rocks and rubble. And in the very first town I walked into, I found an abandoned school full of sadistic raiders who were cutting people's heads off and attacking me. This wasn't at all like the Elder Scrolls, at least in theming, and the relentlessly depressing and worrisome atmosphere in Fallout really turned me off at first. Even when I eventually got around to playing Fallout 4, which had a much less sinister tone, I too found it to have subpar writing and questing, and I quickly gave up on it. And maybe most damning for those of you watching, the absolutely beloved RPG that is Fallout New Vegas was by far my worst first impression of the bunch, as I went in being told it was the best, but found the introduction so tedious I could barely stay awake. And for years after giving all three of these games a shot a couple of times here and there, I just came to the conclusion that Fallout wasn't for me. I was an Elder Scrolls fan through and through, and a post-apocalyptic version of the same formula took away everything that I liked. Well, that's what I thought, until I started making YouTube videos. Because you see, some of the original content I made that helped this channel grow were icebergs, and despite knowing that I wasn't a big fan of Fallout, I also knew how much of a fan base it had, and I guessed correctly that an iceberg going over crazy mysteries would do really well. But what was maybe most surprising in that entire ordeal was just how deep into the lore I got. I knew Fallout had vaults and lots of strange things, but I didn't realize just how interesting they were. As I learned more and more about Fallout and its history, along with the vaults and some of the more wild quests, suddenly my imagination began to go wild. Even after finishing multiple videos on the series and releasing them, I still couldn't get the lore and world building out of my head. I was so fixated on just how fascinating the world of Fallout really was. And suddenly, just like that, I once again had an undying urge to give this series one more shot. For Fallout 3, now knowing so much of the lore, I found the introduction fascinating, really taking my time to roleplay living in a vault and what it would be like. The dreary demeanor of the outside world was now captivating, as I knew some of the absolutely insane vaults that awaited me, and playing them for the first time myself was even more fun than any explanation could give. In Fallout 4, I learned to appreciate the crafting mechanics, which became extremely fun, and building and searching my way through the wasteland became a guilty pleasure for months. And Fallout New Vegas, despite how boring and lacking I still find it in so many ways, once I got into it on hardcore survival mode, it proved to me that it had immaculate writing and quest design that I was craving from this series, along with a lot of ways to build my character with stakes so high. And even going back and looking into especially Fallout 2 from Interplay, I grew to absolutely adore these games too. The hilarious moments and setups, the super deep RPG mechanics and tactics, and really dark and twisted events that left my mouth agape. But maybe most surprising of all, even Fallout 76 can be super fun, with the best environments in the series and multiple updates that make it fun to play and engage with, especially with friends. And really, overall, I have just done a complete 180 on the Fallout series. What started as something I would literally get depressed at playing, and a franchise I look down upon when compared to the Elder Scrolls, has in many ways surpassed it. Because while each game is much different from the last, they all have that unique quality of a harrowing world with wacky and fun themes. And when that's all centered around vaults meant for human torture and experimentation, the universe has practically endless ideas it could use to craft interesting stories and narratives that live on with us long after we finish playing. And it goes to show just how powerful good lore and world building can really be, especially when you take the time to understand it. And it's why after making videos like my Fallout Iceberg or my deep dives into every single vault, I get such strong urges to play again, because knowing the lore behind a game makes it even more fun to play with and interact with because you really understand what's going on. And it's also why I love making so many videos regarding lore and mysteries on this channel, because I hope to inspire you guys who watch them to play some of the games that I've fallen in love with too. And I think there's no better way to do that than have you fall in love with the world behind it all. And in that sense, Fallout is one of the best out there, and it took me so many years to realize it. If you guys have been watching my channel for a while now, you know that there are a select few games on this channel that are beloved by the gaming community at large that I simply don't like. Some of these include titles like Hollow Knight, which I absolutely ripped to shreds in my least popular video of all time that tons of people watching disagreed with vehemently, and I stand by everything I said there. But other games I hated on, after playing more and giving multiple playthroughs, I've come around to. And one of the best examples of this is Disco Elysium. Originally, when I first played the title, engaging with it for any more than 30 minutes would make me feel fatigued out of pure boredom. While I found the writing interesting at times, it was also so pretentious for pretentious sake. And the actual gameplay, if you could even call it that, was so mundane I would have rather just watched a movie about the same premise. And to top it all off, my initial impressions of all of the characters were that they were all very dry and unrelatable. Kim's monotone voice and presentation felt like an art student's obsession with depressed people and the meaninglessness of life come to fruition, and the actual unnamed character I played as at the start of the game was a sad, sorry drunk who had no redeeming qualities. And as if things couldn't get any worse too, the setting of the story, Revachol, was even more unbearable than the characters themselves, and included pretty much nothing I was interested in at all. Socialist and communist bloc countries and their political intrigue, while fascinating in their own right, are about the only section of the entire history of mankind I struggle to find any joy or interest in at all. But while that's a very personal opinion that many others might not share, what was undeniable was that Disco Elysium was a slow game, and one I most definitely was not enjoying at all. I even gave the title a couple of tries too, over 4 in fact, where in each subsequent run I got further and further but never fell in love. That was until the 5th and final time I finally tried this beloved indie icon, where it finally started to click for me. Because this time around I told myself I was going to give this strange game one more try, at the suggestion of so many of my viewers, and really take my time to listen to every bit of dialogue, engage with as many systems as I could, and explore places I hadn't been. And I'm so glad I did. Because you see, as funny as it sounds, I actually still don't like Disco Elysium all that much. But after finally completing it and doing all of the side missions, I get why so many do. There are a variety of awesome side quests and moments in this game, like where you find a ghost upstairs and it turns out to be a young innocent woman, or stumbling upon a truly paranormal event in a church that cascades into coming into contact with some utterly eerie people and entities. And throughout all of it, there are tons of hilarious and absurd things that you can say in dialogue that add a lot of much needed intrigue and comedy to the script. Early on, for example, there are a lot of funny moments like talking to a girl in the hotel room beside yours and immediately failing at flirting. But these moments become so much better once you get the context much later on of what really happened and who these people are. Because in Disco Elysium, you take on the role of a drunk cop who blacked out the night before so hard that he forgot who he was, on a journey to solve a murder that occurred in the very same place you're staying. And this means early on, things are so confusing. You have no connection to anyone, no idea of where anything is, and everything is at least partially a confusing mess on purpose. And it's that mess and trying to reverse it on my first 4 playthroughs that made this such a hard game to love. But once you push through that and start start to get to the later half where the pieces all fall together and you uncover much more interesting places and quests, in my opinion, the game gets much better. And while I still find the setting mind-numbingly monotonous, moments like talking to a widow who you've fallen in love with by the beach about life and its meaning and what love even is makes up for it in spades. Without a doubt, Disco Elysium is a game with a lot of heart and situations that really make you think or laugh, just like one of its inspirations, Planescape Torment, did so many years ago. And it's only after I actually played through the whole game and all of the side content that I finally have a newfound appreciation for the experience. And I'm not going to sit here and act like I absolutely adore this game just for those of you watching, because I know I love seeing creators give love to games that I adore, but after finally completing Disco Elysium, I get why the game has the following it does. It's such a unique and almost surreal experience, and one that certainly is not for everyone, but if you can get past that initial block of bad gameplay, a boring world, and systems like a time mechanic which can be infuriating, you are left with something truly beautiful at the inside of it all. Full of characters that are much deeper than they originally seem, moments that will make your heart sing or your brain question, and RPG mechanics that revolutionize the genre and tie into your character build and choice and consequence perfectly. Certainly not a game I will be recommending non-stop in my videos like say Prey and Cyberpunk, as a lot of you know, but one that I have immense respect for now, and it's sad to see we may never get another game quite like it. There aren't many games out there more beloved than Elden Ring, and for good reason. It's one of the most expansive and awe-inspiring games ever made, it has immaculate gameplay and a huge variety of playstyles, and an art design that is truly breathtaking. So much so that when I first beat the game, I was taken aback by just how much I enjoyed it because of so many memorable boss fights, cool hidden areas and secrets, and a world that you can truly get lost in. There's a reason Elden Ring is so beloved and one of the highest rated games of all time. And because I personally had never played a FromSoft game before Elden Ring, the formula was entirely new to me, which made it even more exciting. But the thing is, over time, my opinion of Elden Ring has only continued to sour, where now I still see it as one of the best games ever made, but on my own personal list, it might not even be in the top 10. And while I know this isn't a popular discussion to have, I still want to be honest and explain why. Even though Elden Ring fans are by far the most rabid out there I've seen and will attack anyone who doesn't love this game, hopefully I can provide some clear reasons as to why. You see, since I first completed Elden Ring, I have not only gone back and played some other FromSoft titles, but I have also gone back and tried to play Elden Ring again as well, especially for the DLC. And I've slowly come to the realization that I actually have a lot of issues with the game too. First of all, because of Elden Ring's massive scale and scope, a lot of things are copy-pasted. There are so many times, for example, where you will fight the exact same boss spread across multiple dungeons, each with similar movesets and styles, and while these things are all completely optional, especially on second or third playthroughs, you start to see how in some spots, quantity took precedence over quality. Sure, each zone in Elden Ring is awe-inspiring in scale, but once you start to dig into every corner and hidden passageway, so many reused assets and enemies become apparent, and the facade starts to break down. In contrast, if you play something like Dark Souls, Sekiro, or Bloodborne, because of their more linear nature, everything feels deliberate and meaningful. You know that no matter where you go, the things you find will be fully thought out and deserving of your undivided attention. And on top of this, because of the open world nature of Elden Ring, you lose some of the better pacing of previous FromSoft titles, which can potentially result in hours wasted going through pointless side dungeons that aren't actually the best content possible. To be fair though too, these dungeons are still fun and provide unique rewards, and as I mentioned before, because Elden Ring has such a grand scale, it really does make the adventure feel more expansive and memorable in a way. But speaking of memorable, another thing I've grown to actually dislike is how Elden Ring handles lore. When I originally played the game, because it was my first time playing a FromSoft title, I hadn't seen any stories told in quite the same way. It was so cool how I understood almost nothing, and how you had to read item descriptions and murals on the wall to try and piece together the insane lore of the past. After all, most of my favorite worlds in gaming are home to largely mysterious places with tons of unanswered questions, and in essence, Elden Ring itself is just one big mashup of all of those things I like. But in retrospect, once again, again, after playing more and watching tons of YouTube videos on the lore of the game, I've actually begun to not like it at all. Weird and strange or unexplainable lore is cool, but when your game's story and past is told in such purposely esoteric and hard to understand ways, it comes off as almost pretentious rather than cool. Or in other words, having some mystery is fun, but that mystery needs to be grounded in something that feels real and tangible. In Elden Ring's case, literally everything about the lore, the characters, and the world is just so overbearing and cumbersome to even try to understand. I would watch literal 1 hour long videos explaining the most mundane things about the lore in Elden Ring, and sure, by the end of it, it made a little more sense, but then you would watch again and realize how many assumptions are just being made, how much bullshit is being intertwined with facts, and more than anything, the feeling that Elden Ring is just trying to be hard to understand just for the sake of it. I appreciated this fact at first because I assumed it was all growing towards something that would make full sense and be more interesting. But after diving down the lore rabbit hole for over a year after the game's initial release, I finally have just come to the conclusion that the lore for this game on the most part sucks. At least for me. And by the way, that's coming from someone who has done over 50 hours of YouTube video content on game lore for tons of different series. Trust me, even once you understand the lore behind Elden Ring just a little bit, it's just kind of boring and weird for no other reason than the writers and designers to pat themselves on the back for how cool their game is, in my opinion. So much so that it often feels like the FromSoft writers just sat in a room and laughed, coming up with crazy ideas, and then tried to figure out how to make them be obscure as possible, which in turn would cause the community to hallucinate tons of random things that only might be true. The lore is so confusing, really anyone can make up any story or explanation for anything and find a way to make it make sense. And when your world building becomes this obscure, in my opinion, you're doing something wrong. I loved it at first, but now I've lessened in that appreciation greatly. And overall, lessening in my appreciation is essentially the story of my journey with Elden Ring. Even in the DLC itself, the zone seems so expansive for no reason at times, with countless dead ends, and in the base game, the final third act feels so rushed, with bosses that are as easy as they come and less attention to detail. I distinctly remember even on my first playthrough getting to the wintry mountaintops and just letting out a sigh knowing I had so much of a game left that I thought was almost over. The thing is though, even despite all that, Elden Ring is truly still one of the greatest games ever made, and without a doubt a triumph in the gaming industry. It's just that in retrospect, when I think back on my own personal time with this title, while I did enjoy it, not only do I not want to ever go back to this world, but I've started to notice more and more of the issues in it. And maybe for some people, they either love these so-called issues and look past them or actually find them as a net positive. But for me, I think in the future, I will look back at Elden Ring as a great game I played and enjoyed, and something I'm proud of beating, but not an experience I really want to undergo ever again by any measure. Not every game has to be fun, but that's hard to understand until you really play one that shows you why that is. And for me, maybe no game did that better than Death Stranding. You see, when I first played the title when it originally dropped on PC, it took me only a couple of hours before I was begging for it to stop. The gameplay consisted of nothing other than walking around and stumbling over rocks, and every story beat and moment was characterized by complete confusion and what felt like a pretentious spectacle whose sole purpose was to draw attention and fruitless intrigue. It was the first time I had ever actually played a Kojima game outside of PT, and well, I wasn't a fan. I wanted an experience that was more engaging and interesting right off the bat, one that had actual deep gameplay systems to learn and a story that made sense. So I put the title down and forgot about it, and joined the legions of players online who detest it to this day because of how boring it can truly be. For many players, this is the type of title where you play the first hour and simply realize it's not for you, and for almost anyone I know in my real life that doesn't play games, I imagine this one would be a hard sell. And yet, some months after the initial PC release, something inside of me just wanted to give it another shot, and I'm so glad I did, because Death Stranding is without a doubt one of the most unique and memorable experiences I've ever had playing a game, despite how quote-unquote boring it can be at times. And that's because the journey of Death Stranding isn't about the fun, it's about something deeper than that. the beauty. When I picked up Death Stranding for the second time, I can remember the exact moment where I fell in love. A couple of hours into the main story, I had been doing nothing but running across desolate rocky landscapes, making my way past goop monsters with only the smallest inkling of what was going on. I was having a better time now that I knew what I was in for, but I wouldn't say I was necessarily having a great time. But then it happened. I got a mission to deliver some supplies to a nearby location called Port Knot City, which contained a massive warehouse next to an ocean that connected the United States through its center. And in order to get there, I had to slowly crawl my way up a massive mountain, which was littered with the goop ghost monsters, which I had to hide from before, holding my breath and walking slowly. It was one of the most tense moments in the game up to this point, but it all culminated in one of the best payoffs ever that shows why this game is so amazing. Because as you approach the ridge of this massive hill or mountain you have climbed after your efforts, suddenly you are met with a sprawling vista. And as your eyes cross the skyline, a roaring and moving track of music starts to blare through your speakers. The world seems to stand still as the hums of soft instruments fill the valley, and before you is Port Knot City in all its glory, beckoning you to come closer. Without exaggeration, this single moment here roused a deep love within me for this game for the entire remainder of the playthrough, because it showed me Death Stranding wasn't all about the walking, or the strange story and unwieldy character interactions. It was about the moments. Simply taking a breath and enjoying the beauty of the world, or closing your eyes and falling into the trance of the music. This wasn't a game like so many others that focused on combat encounters and quests. It was art, transfixed on making you feel things instead. And truthfully, it's such a hard game to sell. I've begged other people to play this game now for a while, and most people like me find it too boring or pointless and quickly put it down. But now that I've really given it a shot and figured out what this title was meant to be, I have to admit, I couldn't have been any more wrong than I was at first. Death Stranding isn't a game like so many others, and in many ways it defies what a game or gameplay loop can be. Yet despite that, I think it captures what's most important in the end anyways. Crafting an experience like no other that stays with us long after we finish playing. And on top of this, the more you dive into this world, the more it takes you in by its grasp. Simple things like the rain and its destruction begin to make more sense the further you get into the story, and the world around you comes into full focus. Suddenly you are met with boss fights that are as thematic as they are engaging to fight, and the more places and regions you uncover, the better the game gets. Whereas most games will as quickly as they can try to engage the player, Death Stranding takes its time, and because it does, results in moments that feel so much more earned and worthwhile, the kind that etch themselves into our souls and minds forever. So if you're like me and gave up on Death Stranding or never gave it a shot because it looked so mundane, trust me, there is something special in this game, and you only can truly realize it by playing it yourself. An experience not about having fun, but rather enjoying the simple things in life. The first time I ever played Red Dead Redemption 2, if I'm being completely honest, I was bored out of my mind. The snow level and slowly going through each tutorial mission was so painful that despite trying the game over 5 times, no matter what, during or just after the snow level, I would finally put my controller down and just give up. Despite how beautiful it was, despite how good the animations were, actually playing Red Dead 2 was so agonizing and frustrating that I just didn't even want to deal with it. On a couple of my later playthroughs, I would even make it more hours into the main story and through a few missions, but every time I would once again get bored and give up. I was skipping cutscenes, not connecting with any of the characters, and overall, I was just not having a good time. For some reason, this industry darling just never seemed to hit for me, where everything that was supposed to be immersive fell flat and proved tedious instead. And I know this actually is fairly common from what I've seen online. Despite how beloved Red Dead Redemption 2 is, tons of people still find it painfully boring, and many never even get to see what the game offers besides the slow introduction. But somehow, some way, this game kept pulling me back over and over again. And only on one of my much later playthroughs, when I decided to actually dedicate the time to play through the main story and wider game, did I realize why it's one of the best ever made. You see, Red Dead Redemption 2 isn't a shooter, it isn't an RPG, and despite being an open world, really it's unlike anything else out there. It's very slow, methodical, methodical, and while it takes forever to get going, by the end it will have you in tears and really show you how powerful storytelling in games can be. While other games try to constantly keep you engaged, Red Dead simply offered a world that is as immersive as they come, and beckons you to slowly dive deeper into it. The whole reason I finally started to even love this title is that I finally met it at its own pace. Instead of trying to rush through missions and reach objectives, I just took my time, wandering around the environment, hunting deer in the wild for food, and spending hours in my camp talking to everyone to get to know them better. And it's when you play Red Dead 2 like this that it truly shines. The writing on offer here is unmatched, the storytelling is riveting and raw, and the characters feel so harsh yet loving at the same time. Arthur's journey is one about redemption, about a man born into unfortunate circumstances who kills and pillages for those he holds close, learning to shed his jarring skin and be birthed into something new, an analogy to the Wild West dying out before his very eyes as well. And going on this journey with Arthur is one of the most powerful narratives in games out there. And I look back and think how funny it is that I used to hate this game, because despite the flaws at its core, it's one of the most important tales we can experience about growing up and sacrificing for those around us. And when you combine that with top-of-the-line immersive elements, once this game has you under its spell, it never lets go. Walking around your camp at night and seeing the embers of a crackling fire disperse into the air as you hear the rumblings from your family about your recent missions, or sifting your way through a babbling brook as the sounds of birds and rainfall in the distance fill your room, is something that no other games offer quite to this level. And I'm not saying I think the game is perfect by any means. It has so many flaws. It's still boring as ever at times, movement and upgrade mechanics feel horrible to me, and the early sections are a complete slog. In fact, if I'm being honest, a game like Cyberpunk 2077 is miles and miles better than Red Dead Redemption 2, but I'd be lying if I said Red Dead wasn't amazing now that I've given it more of a chance. Because Red Dead is a world full of characters and even random NPCs and towns that feel genuine, real, and act like actual downtrodden folks in the Old West, simply doing the best they can to survive. It's the type of game you might not always be in the mood for, and if I'm being frank, I don't know if I ever actually want to play it again. I would just get too bored. But if you are in the right mood and willing to really take your time with this title, not rushing through each mission or just trying to get the best guns, then this is one of the greatest stories ever told in the game's medium, and provides a sense of place in a world that is unmatched by any other games even years later. So without a doubt, I was wrong about Red Dead Redemption 2. Because despite how long it took to grab me, it tells a story and has some very poignant moments that might just make it hard to forget ever. And that's more powerful than any good gameplay, fun introduction, or more engaging movement systems could ever be. It's one of the greatest stories ever told in a game, with some of the highest emotions I've ever felt experiencing art. And that's something that's really special. But as always, thank you guys so much for watching. I really do appreciate you taking the time to watch all of my content and provide feedback, like the videos, or share it with friends and family, as it means so much to me that I finally get to make videos like this that I've wanted to for years, even as a kid, and have a community that can all watch and enjoy. So once again, thank you very much. I hope you all have a nice day, and I'll see you next time.